Welcome to our third lesson on Introduction to the Bible. This is Marion Fox speaking. We're looking at the divisions of the Bible. We will review quickly what we covered in the first two lessons. The Old Testament, containing 39 books, is in our present Bibles. And of course, the New Testament, containing 27 books. This makes a total of 66 books. Now we're looking at the New Testament now. We'll be looking at major divisions of the New Testament. The first major division is what some would call biography. Some refer to it as the Gospels. There's really just one Gospel. We might call it the accounts of the Gospels. The books of Matthew through John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this is a biography of Jesus. There's really only one gospel with four accounts of the gospel. These books do not truly contain a biography, but they're more than a biography. We're looking at the history of the church. That's the fifth book in the New Testament, referred to the Acts, or sometimes called the Acts of the Apostles. Then we have the epistles, which were letters that were written. It would be Romans through Jude. I really don't think the book of Hebrews would qualify as an epistle, but many call it an epistle. We'll look at it in a little more detail later. Then we have a book of prophecy, and that's the book of Revelation, or some refer to it as the Apocalypse, and that's the Greek word for revelation. The epistles, we will subdivide them into various groups. There are epistles to the various churches. This would be the book of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. These would be the ones that were written to churches. Romans was written to the church in Rome, and there probably was more than one congregation in Rome. So it would be the church in Rome, but the various congregations that met probably in homes of people. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the same way, but even Cenchrea which is some distance away, is probably is addressed to them as well. Galatians was to a whole region, and Ephesians might have been a circular epistle, but we'll look at that later. And Philippians was to the church at Philippi, and Colossians to the church in Colossae, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians to the church in Thessalonica. Then we have personal epistles. This would be 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And then that's another way to divide. And another division that's made by various writers, and I believe it's an improper label, is called the pastoral epistles. That would be 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Then there's another way that the epistles are divided. Sometimes they're referred to as the general epistles. Others refer to them as the Catholic epistles. And that can be misleading to think it relates to the Catholic Church. But the Greek word katholikos it just means universal. And so this would be the universal or general epistles. This would be, of course, the books of Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Jude. Now, again, I really don't think Hebrews, by the very structure of the book, is really an epistle. But we'll leave it in this category for right now. I think it was a treatise dealing with doctrinal issues, is what it was. Then we have another way of grouping the epistles, and they call them prison epistles. This would be the books of Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. So they're sometimes subdivided as that. that Paul wrote them while he was in prison, but that's not all that Paul wrote while he was in prison. Again, so that can be a little confusing or cause misunderstanding. Another way they group the epistles is the Pauline epistles, that is, epistles that were written by the Apostle Paul. This would be Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And now then, there's some that claim that he wrote Hebrews, and others say that he didn't. So there's disputing as to whether he wrote the book of Hebrews or not. Book of Matthew, let's go back now to the biographical books. The book of Matthew was written primarily to the Jews, whereas the book of Mark was written primarily to the Roman-speaking people, or Latin-speaking people, or Romans. The book of Luke was written primarily to Greeks and people who think like the Greeks. We go back to Matthew, to Jews and people who think like the Jews, and Mark written to Romans and those who think like the Romans. The thinking of various races or groups of people or ethnic groups might be different depending upon their background. That's not racist, it's just that people think differently. The book of John sets forth the deity of Jesus. So this would be your four biographical books, or sometimes called the four gospels, or I would call them the fourfold gospel. Four end where the book of Acts begins. So they all end at that point. Lesson will be limited to the books of Matthew and Mark. We will have the next lesson, we'll look at Luke and John. And we'll go after that in the book of Acts. The books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the synoptic gospels, from the Greek word for the word optic is to see, and sun or sin is with. So seeing them with the same eye or with the same vision, from the same standpoint. They view the events from the same standpoint, supposedly, that's the claim. Of course, this term synoptic gospels may have been given by those who are skeptical about whether or not even God exists, and certainly might deny that the books are inspired of God. The language on the Lord's cross is very helpful to us to see the background of the thinking of the people in Palestine, what's called Palestine now, and what would have been the land of Judea, that would have been the Roman province of Judea. And Pilate, that would be the Roman governor, wrote a title also upon the cross of Jesus and put it on the cross. And it was written, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, when we see Pilate wrote a title, we're not saying that Pilate wrote with his own hand. He could have caused this to be written, and the title was Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This title, therefore, read many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city. It was written in Hebrew, and in Latin, and in Greek. So in these three languages it was written. And it was meant to give a message to the people. And this would pretty well give the message to most people that were passing by, because they would read one of those three languages if they could read. If they couldn't read, someone might read it for them. Now, the Romans, of course, spoke Latin, and the Roman Empire had two official languages, Latin and Greek. And of course, some of the Jews spoke Hebrew. Most of them would probably Greek as well, and probably Latin. these books, and they may have spoken Aramaic as well, these books are not strict biographies. And of course, bios is life. In Greek, one of the words for life. Graphe is to write. So this is a writing about someone's life. And so these books are not strict biographies. They're not all in chronological order either. So we need to remember that. These books contain some of the history of what we now presently call Palestine, or that region which is now called Palestine, from about 5 BC until about AD 30, and they're not merely biographical. So they give history and other information. They may even give some geographic information. They contain prophecies, and the early church, I believe, used them like tracts to teach people. Each of these books was addressed to a different audience. And these three audiences to which it was addressed would cover the thinking of most cultures and most people in some sense, to a certain extent. Some cultures thought more like the Greeks, others thought more like the Romans, and then others thought more like the Jews. And then there would be combinations of the thinking of these three groups of people. These books record the pre-existence of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, his life, his work, his doctrine, that is what he taught, the controversies with various people that he had, the fulfillment of prophecies, that we fulfill one prophecy after another, his death, his burial, his resurrection, and finally his ascension. So this is that of Jesus the Christ, or the Messiah. The word Christ, Christos in Greek, is the same as the Hebrew word Messiah. So Jesus is the anointed one, the Christ, the Messiah. Books depict Jesus as a prophet, a priest, and a king, and prophesy that he will be judged at his second coming. So he has 4 roles, 3 that he functioned in. He was a king and prophet. We see him as a prophet primarily, and a great teacher. And then he functioned as a priest after his crucifixion and ascension to heaven. And he functioned is now functioning as a king as he rules over his kingdom, the church. These books give information about the Jewish sects and other information. We don't have time to elaborate in detail on the Jewish sects. We'll reserve that for another series of lessons where we'll get some background information that will be helpful in interpreting the Bible. But there's 2 main sects. That would be the Sadducees and the Pharisees. There was another sect called the Herodians, and then there's still another sect that's not mentioned in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are concerned primarily with the Lord's ministry in a region called Galilee. Galilee is to the north of Judea. The Roman province of Judea included the region called Samaria. Between Galilee and Judea was a group of people called the Samaritans. That was their region. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' ministry was in Galilee, and he was ministering there. And they record most primarily with that region, Galilee. And John is concerned primarily with the Lord's ministry in the province of Judea. John devoted much more of his book to the last weeks of the Lord's life, just prior to his crucifixion. And so again, you have to keep in mind that he goes over some beginning stuff, but then he goes quickly and gets to the last part of the Lord's life. Now, we have two records of the Lord's genealogy, and his genealogy in Matthew 1:1 begins with Abraham, which was what we would expect if it was directed to the Jews. They would be concerned about the descent from Abraham. Anything other than that, they're not concerned about. The book of Matthew 1:1 reads, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So again, he skips over the various men. He goes from Jesus to David to Abraham. Now, this was just skipping over, and this was hitting the highlights. And what we get then is he's going to fill in the gaps between that is the people here. But he did this, skipping some others in that genealogy. He also depicts Jesus as the son of David 11 times in the book of Matthew. Again, he is the son of David, the son of Abraham. And the term son of could be a descendant. My father died when I was 18 years old, and my grandfather lives another nearly 20 more years, about 15 more years approximately. But he referred to me as son, and even though I was his grandson, he would call me son. And I didn't think he was using the word wrongly. So the word son can refer to a grandson or a great-grandson. So, but Matthew depicts Jesus as the son of David. And that's important because prophecy prophesied of the Messiah being the son of David, a descendant of David. This is what we'd expect if this book was written to appeal to Jewish readers. And that's exactly what we see here. The genealogy of Joseph is listed in Matthew 1:1 through 16. Because Jewish lineage did not pass through a woman, they didn't like to pass their lineage through a woman. We see this in Numbers 27, verses 1 and following, and other genealogies of the Jews. Women were rarely counted in the genealogies of the Old Testament. It was acceptable to list a woman who was mentioned in the scriptures in one's genealogy. So there are 4 women that are listed in the Lord's genealogy in Matthew: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. And so we see these 4 women all listed in the Lord's genealogy. Now, we won't go back and study these women, but they have an interesting background, all 4 of them do. 2 of them, actually 3 of them, are actually not even descendants of Abraham. Right? Bathsheba, it appears to be. And so we see 3 of the 4 are Gentiles. I find that very interesting. Jesus is king of the 12 tribes in Matthew 19:28. And Jesus said unto them, verily I say unto you, that ye who have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit on the throne of his glory, he shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So in the period of the regeneration or the new birth, the Son of Man would sit on his throne when the new birth was in effect. That's what that's saying. Generation. Jesus is depicted as the king of the Jews in a number of passages. In the passages we have here, Matthew 1:1 through 17, and chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, chapter 21:5, 25:31 through 36, through 46, and 27:37. These Jews. Matthew records 65 different quotations of prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. This is many more than the other books recorded. Again, that would appeal to Jews because they were looking for the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies in the Messiah. These would appeal to Jewish readers looking for Matthew views Jesus as a royal lawgiver. In Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 19, Moses said, Jehovah, or the Lord thy God, will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me, unto him ye shall hearken. So there's a prophet going to be raised up like me, according to all that thou desirest of the Lord thy God, or Jehovah thy God in Horeb, in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of Jehovah my God. Let me see this great fire anymore, that I die not. Now, in this instance, you need to go back and read in the book of Exodus, and you see that God was speaking to them with his law from Mount Sinai. And the people became terrified because God was speaking directly to all the nation. And the people became fearful. They were afraid they were going to die from it. And so they asked Moses to go up and mediate for them. And so then that's when Moses went up onto the mount. He had been up on the mount before, but he went up there again. Verse 17, and the Lord or Jehovah said unto me, they have well said that which they have spoken. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command them. So just like Moses, he's going to speak for God. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. And this is a prophecy of Jesus. Now, when you study it more fully, you'll see that it is said to be the prophecy of Jesus in other passages, but we won't be looking at it at the other passages right now. Now, let's look at an outline of Matthew. It's a very interesting book. It's divided into three sections. The first outline divided into three sections, introduced by the statement from that time. If you could go to the first verse, chapter 1, verse 1, through chapter 4, verse 16, and verse 17 says from that time. So we get a division of the book, and it continues on from verse 17 through chapter 16, verse 20. And verse 21 says from that time again. And then the third division would be from chapter 16, verse 21 to the end of the book. So we have three divisions, and they fit quite well. Matthew has a fondness for arranging things in groups of three, and it's quite common in the book of Matthew. So topics will be arranged in three divisions, three groups of three. The second way of outlining Matthew, and this is from the text of Matthew itself, Matthew is divided into 5 sections. If we look at it from a standpoint of the statement when Jesus had finished. So we go up to Matthew 7:28, and we hear that Jesus had finished when Jesus had finished. Then we go to chapter 11 up from there up to chapter 11, verse 1, when Jesus had finished. And again to chapter 13, 53, chapter 19, 1, and chapter 26, 1. So we have 5 natural divisions there. And this would help us to view the book. So there's 5 sections there. Whereas the other way of dividing it was the statement from that time, we have 3 divisions. Matthew arranges the teaching of Jesus into clusters rather than placing them in chronological order in which they occurred. So he summarized the material. He put it together. These clusters are arranged according to their common thoughts. Let me illustrate this. I know some of the older preachers that for which I had great respect, they would take some of their sermons from time to time and basically transcribe them and put them in written form. And there may be sermons preached over a period of 3 or 4 or 5 or even 10 or 15 or 20 years. They put them together into a book. And the book can be very useful for other preachers to study. This is another way of teaching. So these clusters are arranged according to their common thoughts. And that's exactly what we see Matthew doing here, like some of these preachers, older preachers that I don't know. There's no solid evidence proving when the book of Matthew was written. And I have not seen any evidence whatsoever. We see assertions, we see claims, but when they get down to proving their claims, there are really no proofs. The liberals, the skeptics, want to date these books later, and we'll see why, some of the reasons why, because of prophecy, because liberals who are really, many of them are agnostics or atheists, outright atheists, that are teaching Bible in the colleges like Harvard, Yale, Princeton. They don't believe that there's a God at all. They're atheists. And yet they're teaching Bible, and young men go and study at their feet and become atheists along with them. But there's no solid evidence proving when that book was written. I date it very early because it was written for the Jews. And it may have been written within 3 or 4 years after Pentecost, maybe even within a year or two after Pentecost, in my view. It's admired that we're looking at the book of Mark. Remember, the Jews were looking for someone to fulfill prophecy and the working of miracles. Let me back up just one point here now. Matthew, because it was written to the Jewish people had instructions in the 13th and the 18th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy not to accept anyone as a prophet unless he did 2 things. And he put those 2 chapters together. You see, those 2 things would be, he had to work miracles that always come to pass, or show signs that always come to pass. And everything he taught had to harmonize with the scriptures they already possessed. Well, that would be an axiomatic matter, because if the man is a prophet of God, God is guiding his speech. Nothing that he teaches can conflict or be contrary or contradict what God has said elsewhere, because God cannot lie. It's impossible for God to lie. Therefore, we would expect them to show miracles to prove that they're God's spokesman, and everything they taught was in harmony with the scriptures. They already possessed what God had already said. And what he said to the Jews would be what's in the scriptures. So the Jews then were looking for someone to work miracles and to fulfill prophecy, and also to teach things that were totally in harmony with the scriptures they possessed. Now, so Jesus is depicted in all 3 of those categories in the book of Matthew. The Romans were great builders. They were engineers and builders. The Romans then admired a man of action to get the job done. And that was important. Jesus is depicted as a man of action in the book of Mark. Mark himself uses in his record of the Lord's life, uses the word straightway. Eutheos is an adverb of manner, and he uses it 40 times. Theos is an adverb, and it's an adverb of manner. The omega sigma ending is an adverb of manner. Straightway, immediately, or forthwith, or shortly, or soon. He was busy. He was quickly getting the job done. That's exactly how he's depicted over and over, 40 times in the book of Mark. Depicts Jesus as hurrying to accomplish his task on the earth. He has just a limited time to do it. He's busy doing the work. That's how he depicts Jesus. Stresses the works of Jesus more than the words of Jesus. Not that he doesn't emphasize the words, but there's more stress on his works, what he did. And of course, that's exactly what the Romans look for, a man of action to get the job done. Nearly 40% of the book of Mark relates to the last week of the Lord's life, leading up to his death on the cross. This is commonly called the Passion Week. And the word passion, I believe, is used in the first chapter of Acts and in some translations. Only Mark records the events of Mark 14, verses 51 and 52. None of the other record that event. Mark has more parables and more miracles per page than the other accounts, Matthew, Luke, and Mark. And now the books are different lengths, so I'm comparing them by per page. And as by per page, what I've done is I've counted the pages in my American Standard Bible for each of the books, and then I use a ratio. That's how I've done it. And so he has more parables and more miracles. Now, the miracles would be the man of action doing work. This, of course, would impress the Romans. Mark does not quote as many Old Testament passages per page as does Matthew. And of course, the Romans didn't have the old law of Moses, the Old Testament. Now, the church would teach them the law, but they're primarily understanding the New Testament. And we can get into a danger if we're not careful in the church by just studying the New Testament and not understanding the Old Testament as part of the background of the Old Testament. It's part of the context. So we need to study all 66 books in the Bible. The word law is not in the book of Mark at all. Not there. Since Mark was written for Roman readers, or those who think like the Romans, it would not have been written until after the gospel began to be taken to the Gentiles. So it wasn't written early. Now, some of the skeptics, atheists and agnostics that don't believe that God even exists, and certainly that he didn't write the books of the Bible, these people claim that Mark was written first. Many of them do. We'll look at that in a little bit of detail. And then all of the other books came out of him, and they were just copied him, plagiarized him, and added stuff to it. And they got other things from word of mouth from people. So they just take it to be nothing more than a story that's written down by men without any guidance from God. Since Mark records that the gospel had been preached everywhere, Mark 16:20, it must have been written later in the ministry of the apostles, possibly after Paul went to Rome. Right? So he records that. And that's in Mark 16:21, everywhere preaching the word. So this is possibly after Paul went to Rome. End of the book of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, is not found in several manuscripts. I have no doubt it's legitimate, and that becomes a textual problem. But we're not going to go into that textual problem in this course. I believe there's several books that have been written that defend the book, these verses, that is. And so we can give those links to you, or names of the books later if you want them. What is the explanation for the absence of these verses in some of the manuscripts? Not in very many manuscripts, but in a few. and some of the manuscripts where it's not found are fairly old. I think it was at the end of the scroll and the page was lost. That's one explanation, and it's probably the most likely. I don't know that we can know why for sure. The second possible explanation is the book was written in an incomplete format, with the latter portion added by Mark later. And some of these incomplete manuscripts were found and copied. That's a view that's held by some. And that's a plausible view. And so these are the two main plausible views to explain it. Now, in Mark 14, verses 51 and 52, the scripture says that a certain young man, when you see the word certain in the King James and American Standard Version, it's someone prominent. And so that was the certain. When I was in Russia in 1993-94, preaching there in December and January of 93 and January of 94, preaching, and I had 4 debates. When that occurred, I was lecturing in English, of course. I did speak some Russian, but I'm not fluent. But when I did, they had English speaking people around, and the college or the university where I was wanted me for them to tour me around the city of Yaroslavl, to take me around and to view things. But when I went, there was a woman that guided me, and she spoke English, but she had learned English in England. And she would refer to this certain place, that certain place, and they were prominent places around in the city. And I saw how she was using the word certain as the British people would use it, as something prominent. And that's exactly, I saw that, and I studied it more, and I saw that that's exactly what we have, and that's what the Greek word here refers to. It points out someone more prominent usually. So let's read it again. I digressed a minute. And a certain young man followed with him, having a linen cloth cast about him. Now, a linen cloth is something that would be expensive. So this young man was fairly wealthy over his naked body. And then they laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled naked. Now, the word naked in the Bible isn't always completely without any clothing on whatsoever. It would refer to someone who was insufficiently clad and didn't have all that he needed. If you were in the bad cold winter time, we just had temperatures down to 0 Fahrenheit just recently here. And if you went out with a short sleeve shirt on like I would wear in the summertime, and a pair of pants, light pants, you'd get very cold. You get cold very quickly. You'd be naked in the sense you're not sufficiently clad. So I don't know that he was totally without any clothing whatsoever. I've been just his inner garments that were there, and one would deem himself to be naked if all he had on was his inner garments. And we would say, go with our underwear here in the United States. Many commentators think that Mark is referring to himself, the certain young man here. The book of Matthew was written primarily to the Jews and recorded the evidence that Jesus is the Messiah, fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. Mark was written primarily to the Romans and records the mighty works of Jesus. And that's going to appeal to a Roman or a person who thinks like the Romans. In a sense, the people in the United States think a little bit like the Romans because we have been builders of things. But there's still some within our society. There are groups that think more like the Jews, and some that think like the Greeks. We'll get to Luke later in the next lesson. Matthew was written primarily partly to prove that Jesus was the fulfillment of Old Testament scriptures. Mark was written to prove that Jesus is the Son of God, probably to the Romans, the Latin-speaking people. So he's proving he's the Son of God in the flesh, deity. John records that the world could not contain the books that could have been written about Jesus in John 21:25. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they should be written, everyone, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that should be written. In other words, he's being emphatic, but there could have been a stack of books that would reach to the ceiling that have been written about Jesus. There's been a lot of things written. But what happened is, if you read on in this, all the way through verse 31, you'll see that God chose the things that would give them faith and cause them to have the faith that would save them. Verses 30 and 31 of John chapter 20. The Holy Spirit had an immense amount of material for which he could draw when he directed the four writers to write these four books. At John 21:25. But he chose the material that suited him because he is God, he is deity. And he suited him to accomplish the purpose for the writing of each book. Matthew for the Jews, Mark for the Latin-speaking people, Luke for the Greek-speaking people. These three groups would cover most people in the whole earth, but would appeal a little bit to most people in there. Now, these two books end with the ascension of our Lord and his commission to his apostles to preach the gospel to the whole world. We see that in both Matthew and Mark. Matthew 28 and Mark 16. The book of Acts then picks up where Matthew and Mark left off. Matthew was written primarily to appeal to Jewish readers. Matthew, by the direction of the Holy Spirit, shows the facts about Jesus that would appeal to Jews. Mark was written primarily to appeal to Latin-speaking people, the Romans, and people who think like them. And Mark, by the direction of the Holy Spirit, shows the facts about Jesus that would appeal to Romans. And of course, these facts do not conflict with one another, they're not contradictory, neither are they contrary to one another. This ends our third lesson on this, and we'll be looking at this in our next lesson.